Hi, I'm Professor Green, and let's go ahead and get started with part two of chapter 13. Again, a really interesting topic, in my opinion. What are the modes to enter foreign markets? Exporting, turnkey projects, licensing, we've discussed already a little bit in this course. We'll go into that deeper. Franchising a little bit, we've talked about. Joint ventures, we've certainly spoken about, but wholly owned subsidiaries, not so much. So let's go ahead and talk about these and what are the differences. Give you also examples of each. So exporting, which we'll get into a lot of detail in the next chapter, in chapter 14. This is often the first method used to enter foreign markets, right? Relatively low cost, not a lot of capital that goes into setting up, your own shop or own warehouse, et cetera, in a foreign country. Firms may achieve the experience curve and location economies. So the nice thing that you can kind of slowly understand the country that you're moving into. But there are different disadvantages. Lower cost manufacturing locations may exist. So people might already be doing this in your country for cheaper, right? So, right, why would you produce t-shirts in the United States and then try and sell them in India, right? They're going to be very expensive when you could just produce the t-shirts in India and sell them there because the labor cost and capital costs are much lower. Transportation costs might be high. Tariff barriers, as we've talked about a lot in this course, can make it uneconomical. Foreign agents fail to act in the exporter's best interests. So, yeah, that you also often need an agent. There are people that, do import-export as a full-time job, and they can sometimes take advantage. They don't often have the best of reputations. So we see this a lot with multinational chemical firms, pharmaceuticals sometimes as well, where they manufacture products in one particular country in the region, and then they export that to many different regions. I think of there's a lot of pharmaceutical production in India, and then they will then export those products to all over Asia, as well as back into the US as well. So one possibility, exporting, as I said, we'll get into that very deeply in the next chapter. Let's now talk about turnkey projects. And at first you might think, like, why would anybody ever want to do a current turnkey project? This involves a contractor who handles every detail of the project for a foreign client, including the training and operating of the personnel. So now we're thinking of oil-rich countries because they have developed a technology within their country to get the oil out of the ground, but they don't want to necessarily have a lot of foreign direct investment into their country because they want to be the ones getting the oil out of the ground in their country. But they've developed that amazing technology to do that. And so they say, okay, well, we'll export that technology to other countries. So at the completion of the contract, the foreign client now is handed the key to a plant that is ready for full operation. So you can really think that this is exporting a technology, but in this instance, they call it a turnkey project. And so they really are exporting really their know-how. There's an advantage that there's great economic return because this know-how can be highly valuable. It's usually a technologically complex process. It's less risky than conventional FDI, because you just kind of go in and out really fast. Over a couple of years, maybe a couple of months, you help them get set up, but then you come back. And especially if you're in a developing country, like if they're taking this technology to different parts of Africa that have oil, right? There are a lot of uncertainties that often come with these developing countries. The rules change, labor laws, et cetera, can be unstable. And so they don't have to deal with that afterwards, which is nice. The disadvantage is that the firm has no long-term interest in the country. And I think this is also important when a country then welcomes turnkey projects, because they'll know that the countries that are working then in their country don't necessarily care about how the project's going to be in 10 years or the people or how it's going to affect their long-term outlook in that country. There can be a lot of disadvantages there. It can also create a competitor, right? So if you're in an oil-rich country, Now, and in African countries now drilling for oil. Now there's oil out there that will compete with the oil in your country. The firm's process technology is a source of competitor advantage. So again, now that technology that you covet so nicely is now known in other places with other people with other lands, and you will have more and more competitors. And so yeah, so an interesting place and time when these things might happen. This technological complex process, right, is often very expensive, and so that's why countries might invite a turnkey project. Let's go ahead and hop into licensing. I grew up, my childhood friend, her mother always worked for Warner Brothers. And so she would travel the world looking for products where she could put the Warner Brothers logo on it, right? Bugs Bunny, et cetera. We had, my friend had so many plush toys, et cetera, because all they were doing is taking the brand and stamping that onto a product. And so why would you want to do something like this? A licensor grants the rights to intangible property to another entity for a specified time period and receives a royalty fee in return. I'm talking less about kind of consumer goods here, but more talking about maybe more complex goods, let's say. Xerox is a good example. They invented the copier, and then they licensed that know-how to Fuji in Japan. And then Fuji paid Xerox a 5% royalty fee. And so the intangible property includes patents, inventions, formulas, processes, designs, copyrights, and trademarks. Again, we've spoken about licensing already in this course. The advantages, right? The firm does not bear the development costs and risk associated with it, opening up a whole new foreign market. So Xerox wouldn't have to go into Japan and start from scratch. It avoids barriers to investment like capital. Firms with intangible property might have business applications, but doesn't want to develop these applications itself. It can capitalize on the market opportunities. So again, the competitive advantage of Xerox with their copiers and with the software that they run for copiers, that they can now work in Japan, but they don't necessarily want to do all the rollout in Japan. And so that would be a really nice way, because they don't understand the Japanese market very well. And so that would be a really nice way for them to grab a fee with little work. The disadvantage is also that the firm doesn't have the total control over the manufacturing, marketing, and strategy. And we saw this in the example of Burberry in the previous chapters. So Burberry licensed their name and products to Asia, but then the licensee that kind of took the products in a direction that Burberry didn't agree with. The products got cheaper, et cetera. And then they eventually then withdrew that licensing agreement. The firm's ability to coordinate strategic moves across different countries is compromised, right? So you don't have as much control anymore. And there's a potential for loss of proprietary technology or property. So that's exactly what happened with Xerox, because they didn't watch so closely what Fuji was doing. And very quickly, Fuji and other organizations then started to copy Xerox, and Xerox very quickly lost market share. So now the next step of getting a little bit more involved is franchising. And right, again, I always think of McDonald's. I grew up, and a friend of my mother's had friends who owned 1 or 2 McDonald's, and they were multimillionaires, and we thought, wow, how can you make so much money selling hamburgers? Didn't seem like a very, challenging job. But it's true, because McDonald's name has such an amazing value. The brand has just done so well. And how they've done that is through franchising, but having really tight controls in their franchising. So it's a form of licensing. The franchisor sells these intangible property and requires the franchisee to abide by very strict rules as to how it does business. So, right, that's a big big difference between licensing. Franchising has much more rules around it. It eliminates the costs and risks of opening up a foreign market alone. So again, Subway, for example, it doesn't have to start their own Subway stores. They they then figure out people who want to do that in Asia or wherever they are, and then they give them the rights to the name and the logo and the processes, etc. But it may inhibit the firm's ability to take profits out of one country to support a competitor tax in another, right? So that each individual store is owned by another person. So you can't start moving money around from store to store if that is necessary. Also, the geographic distance of the firm from its foreign franchisees can make it difficult to detect poor quality. And McDonald's saw that happening, that all of a sudden, oh my gosh, people would go and get a bad hamburger or, get bad shake or French fries, and then the brand, reputation would go down. So what McDonald's does is that they have like a master franchisee in each country for the most part, and they then oversee all the smaller franchises to make sure that that quality stays up to the standards of what McDonald's here in the United States would like to see. So again, a really interesting and viable model. Joint venture, again, we talked about this a lot already in this course. Joint only, it's usually 50-50. The firm can benefit from a local partner's knowledge. I think it's so interesting that Starbucks actually does this quite often because they feel they know ahead of time that they don't know enough about these foreign markets. So they will initially join and go into a joint venture with someone. And then after a couple of years, they'll move into what's going to be our next stage. It's a wholly owned subsidiary. But before we get there, let's talk about a little bit more about joint ventures. It shares the costs and risks of opening a foreign market with a partner, can help minimize the risk of nationalization or other adverse government interference. So India, for example, required that any foreign direct investment coming into India in the, I think, 80s, 90s, et cetera, and for a couple of decades there, had to join a joint venture, had to create a joint venture so that they wanted the Indian firms to make sure that they could grab onto some technology, that they, weren't being left in the dust by foreign investment. And so the government imposed these rules. The disadvantages of joint ventures are that the firm risks giving control of its technology to its partner, right? Which is what India was looking for, to get some control of that technology. The firm may not have the tight control of the subsidiary. And so there's an experience curve. So, right. So very often, as we see in some companies, that they will hide certain proprietary processes or technology so that they don't, that the joint venture company doesn't have access to those things. We saw that with Boeing and Mitsubishi. So they went into Japan, but Boeing didn't want Mitsubishi to have access to all of their technologies. So they created, they walled off a certain handful of technologies. There's shared ownership that can lead to conflicts and battle for control if the objects differ or change over time. So again, really important that that companies maybe hire a consultant to help you with your contract when you enter into a joint venture. Let's go ahead now into, because I think I covered everything for joint ventures. Let's go into wholly owned subsidiaries. The firm owns 100% of the stock. This is now Uber, right? So very aggressive, didn't want to partner with anybody, just wanted to do their own thing. Start now, ask questions later. Set up a new operation in that firm called a greenfield venture. Again, we've talked about that already in this course. Or maybe you just acquire an established firm to start on your own. IKEA does this as well because they just feel like their product is, very Swedish and, been perfected in many different countries. And so they don't do any type of joint venture except India. They did decide to do that because they felt like they needed to know the Indian market so much better. But in most countries, they do a wholly owned subsidiary just from the beginning. And so the advantages that they reduce the risk of losing control over the core competencies. So they have access to those technologies, processes, ideas, allows for tight control over the operations, may be required if a firm is trying to realize local and experience curve economies. So that's probably in the case of IKEA, right? So they're really trying to ramp up and really grab a lot of market share through these ideas. Disadvantages are that the firm bears the full costs and risks of setting up overseas operations. And so, again, really important to really understand what it takes when you set up a wholly owned subsidiary. There's a nice little chart over the next two slides that highlights each of these different modes and the advantages and repeats the disadvantages as well. So perhaps useful when you go through and create your projects for this semester. I'm going to go ahead and stop here with video number 2 for chapter 13, and I will see you in the last video in a few minutes.